She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She just looked at the most dangerous man in Rome and whispered 7 words that cracked something open inside him that 20 years of blood and silence had buried. He came to destroy her. He ended up destroying himself. This is the story of Dante Viscari, a man who confused revenge with justice, power with control, and possession with love. And Alara Bellori, a woman who refused to break, even when everything she had ever built was turned to ash. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came in hard that night, the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as attack. Sheets of it slapping the cobblestones of Rome like an open palm against bare skin, pooling in the gutters, turning the ancient streets into rivers of black mirror. It was past midnight, and the city that usually never slept had gone quiet in the way cities do when something violent is about to happen, and even the buildings seemed to hold their breath. Dante Viscari stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his study on the 3rd floor of the Viscari estate, a glass of cognac in his right hand that he hadn't touched in 40 minutes. He was not a man who paced. He was not a man who fidgeted or let his hands shake or raised his voice past the level of quiet conversation. His father had taught him that control was the only currency that mattered, and Dante had spent 34 years accumulating it like a man who understood that the moment you let something show on your face, you had already lost. But tonight, looking at the documents spread across his mahogany desk, the invoices, the account statements, the photographs, his jaw was so tight that the muscles in his cheek had started to ache 2 hours ago and hadn't stopped. His brother Marco was in a cell. Marco, who still sent their mother flowers every Sunday even though she had been dead for 9 years. Marco, who had laughed too loud at dinner last Christmas and spilled wine on the tablecloth and looked up embarrassed like a child even though he was 31 years old. Marco, who had trusted Dante with his whole chest his entire life, and had never once given him reason to doubt that trust. Marco was in a cell because 40 million euros had moved through accounts bearing his name, and the paper trail was meticulous, almost elegant, the kind of construction that took months to build and required someone with access, with reputation, with the right connections in the right world. The kind of world that didn't look like crime from the outside. The kind of world that wore silk and spoke at gallery openings and shook hands with senators. The kind of world that bore the name Bellori. Dante set the cognac down without drinking it. He picked up the top photograph from the stack on his desk. It showed a woman standing at the entrance of the Bellori Gallery on the Via della Conciliazione, a building he knew by sight, white and elegant and slightly old-fashioned in the way that old Roman money always presented itself. The woman was 26 years old, according to the file Rocco had assembled. She had dark hair pinned back, a charcoal coat, a leather folder tucked under one arm. She looked like someone who didn't waste time on anything, including the camera. Alara Bellori, owner of record, director of operations. Her signature was on 11 of the 14 fraudulent invoices. Her name was attached to 3 of the shell accounts. The gallery's provenance certification system had been used to launder the documentation on paintings that didn't exist. Dante's people had been watching her family for 6 days. Her father, Cesare Bellori, had departed Rome on a private flight to Lisbon 4 days ago. Her brother Luca had followed 2 days later, destination unknown, traveling under a secondary passport. They had planned this exit with the kind of careful timing that meant they had known exactly when the walls would start to close. They had left Alara behind. That detail had snagged in Dante's mind like a hook and wouldn't let go. He had turned it over 20 times in the last week, looking for the angle where it made sense, where it meant she was staying to manage the fallout, to buy time, to protect some piece of the scheme that couldn't travel on an airplane. But the detail kept refusing to cooperate with any clean narrative. It just sat there. They left her behind. He had told himself it didn't matter. Blood answered for blood. The Bellori name was on the documents. The Bellori Gallery was the mechanism. A Bellori would answer. He had told himself a lot of things this week. His phone vibrated against the desk. One word from Rocco. Done. Dante drained the cognac in a single swallow, put on his jacket, and went downstairs. They brought Alara Bellori through the rear entrance of the estate at 12:47 in the morning. Dante watched from the doorway of the east corridor as two of his men walked her across the courtyard through the rain. She wasn't in handcuffs. Dante's people didn't operate that way. But the positioning of the men around her made the nature of the situation clear enough. She was wearing the same charcoal coat from the photograph, darkened now with rain, her hair loose and plastered to her neck. She was carrying nothing. She stopped walking when she saw him. Most people, when they saw Dante Viscari for the first time in a context like this, had a specific response. They went pale. Or they went very still in the way animals go still when the predator locks onto them. Or they started talking immediately, filling the silence with words because silence felt like a countdown. Ilara Bellori looked at him for 3 full seconds and said, "Your men didn't tell me why I was being brought here." Her voice was steady. Not performing steadiness, actually steady, the way people are steady when they've spent a lot of time making difficult decisions alone. "Come inside," Dante said. She came inside. He led her to the study. His men stayed in the corridor. He closed the door and gestured toward the chair across from his desk, and she sat in it without hesitation, which told him something about her. She kept her back straight. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at the documents spread across his desk before she looked at him, and her eyes moved across them quickly. Cataloging, he realized. She was already reading them upside down. "You know what those are?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I know what they're supposed to be," she said. "Invoices from the Bellori Gallery. I'm trying to determine whether they're the originals or copies." She paused. "May I?" He watched her face. "Go ahead," he said. She leaned forward and picked up the top invoice, and something shifted in her expression almost immediately. A tightening around the eyes, subtle enough that a less careful observer would have missed it. She put that one down and picked up the next one, then the account statements. She went through them one by one, slowly, and the room was so quiet that Dante could hear the rain against the windows and the precise sound of paper against paper. "These bear my signature," she said. "They're good forgeries. The letterhead is accurate. The account numbers in the originating fields are real accounts belonging to the gallery." She set the last document down and sat back. "Where did you get these?" "From your gallery's own filing system," Dante said. "My accountants pulled the duplicates from a secondary server that your IT infrastructure apparently didn't know existed." She looked at him steadily. "Those are not invoices I signed. The signature is close, but the pressure distribution is wrong. I press harder on the loop in the E. And that account," she pointed to the third document without picking it up, "was closed 14 months ago after a vendor dispute. My father handled the closure. Only he would have had the archived account number to use." Dante said nothing. "Your brother is Marco Viscari," she said. "He was arrested 4 days ago. The fraud total is reported at 40 million euros. She held his gaze. "You think my family did this to your brother?" "Your family did do this to my brother." "My father did this to your brother," she said. "Possibly my brother Luca as well. I'm telling you I didn't know." She said it without heat, without desperation. She said it the way someone states a measurement, precisely, and not for debate. "Everyone tells me they didn't know," Dante said. "I imagine they do." She looked at the photographs on his desk, her father at an airport, her brother boarding a small aircraft, and something moved across her face then, something that cracked through the composure for just a moment. Not tears. Not yet. Something more internal than that, like a foundation shifting. "They're gone. 4 days ago. 2 days ago. And they didn't tell me." She said it quietly, more to herself than to him. "No." The silence stretched. Dante watched her sit with it, watched her absorb it and not collapse and not start bargaining and not say anything for almost a full minute. Outside, the rain intensified against the glass. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked. Dante looked at her across the desk. In his world, the answer to that question was usually simple. But something about the way she had gone through those documents, the competence of it, the lack of theater, had lodged itself somewhere inconvenient in his chest, and he was aware of it the way you're aware of a stone in your shoe, unable to stop noticing it even when you want to. "I'm going to take everything your name is attached to," he said. "The gallery, your accounts, your reputation. By morning, Rome will know the Bellori name as the architects of a fraud that put an innocent man in a cell. She didn't flinch, but her hands, he noticed, pressed together in her lap. You know I'm innocent, she said. I know your family destroyed mine. That's not the same answer. No, he said, it's not. She looked at him for a long time, and then she said quietly, without drama, without any performance at all, You're becoming exactly like the men who betrayed your brother. Dante opened his mouth and closed it again. Because for the first time in years, possibly for the first time since his mother had died and left him alone in a world that ran on cruelty and calculation, he did not have an answer. By 4 a.m, it was done. Dante's lawyers had filed the civil seizure orders. His media contacts had received the documentation package, edited, shaped, framed to tell a specific story. The story of Alara Bellori, the quiet, cultured face of a sophisticated fraud. The woman who had used her gallery's unimpeachable reputation to launder 40 million euros while her father and brother fled with the money. The woman who had signed the invoices and certified the accounts and smiled at Rome's elite while her brother-in-law, Marco Vescari, a man whose only crime was trust, sat in a police cell. The morning editions ran it at 6. By 7, Alara's primary bank accounts had been frozen pending investigation. By 8, 3 artists whose work was featured in the Bellori Gallery's upcoming spring show had issued statements withdrawing their participation. By 9, the gallery's insurance carrier had suspended coverage. Dante sat in his study and watched his phone accumulate notifications and felt none of the satisfaction he had expected. Alara was in a guest room on the second floor under loose but unmistakable watch. She had not been told she was confined, not explicitly, but the locked grounds, the absence of her phone, and the polite but immovable presence of Dante's men in every corridor communicated the situation clearly enough. She had asked for access to a laptop at 6 a.m. Dante had said no. At 9, Rocco Salvi came into the study without knocking, which was his habit, and one that Dante had long since stopped remarking on. Rocco was 52, silver-haired, with the kind of face that looked honest because it had spent 40 years practicing. He had been Dante's father's closest advisor and had transferred that role to Dante without interruption. He was, Dante had always believed, the most loyal man he knew. "It's clean," Rocco said, dropping into the chair across the desk. "The press is running with it. I've had 3 calls from senators this morning expressing sympathy about Marco. Nobody is looking at us." "Good," Dante said. "The girl?" "She stays here until her father surfaces." Rocco nodded slowly. "She hasn't made noise?" "No." Rocco looked at him with the particular sharpness he deployed when he was checking for something. "You're not going soft, Dante." "Don't do that," Dante said. "I'm asking. I heard you the first time." Dante turned back to the window. "She stays here. We use her as leverage to draw Cesare Bellori back into range. That's the calculation." Rocco was quiet for a moment. "And if Cesare doesn't come back?" Dante said nothing, because that was a question he had been sitting with since 4 a.m, and he didn't have an answer that he liked. 3 days passed before Alara asked again for access to financial records. She made the request through the housekeeper, Maria, a round-faced woman in her 60s who had worked for the Vescari estate for 30 years, and who Dante noticed was already bringing Alara extra coffee in the mornings without being asked. Alara had apparently thanked her for it in Italian so precise and so warm that Maria had reported the exchange to Dante with a degree of approval that he hadn't solicited. He sat with the request for a day. Then he told his financial team to pull complete copies of everything they had seized from the Bellori Gallery's servers and have them delivered to Alara's room. He told himself it was because having her reconstruct the scheme from her end might surface information they'd missed. He didn't examine that reasoning too carefully. She worked through the night. He knew because he was awake through the night too, 2 floors below, doing the same thing he had been doing since Marco went to prison. Reading through everything, looking for the seam in the construction, the place where someone had gotten lazy or careless or overconfident. At 2 in the morning, he got up for water and walked past the east staircase and could see the thin line of light under the door of her room at the end of the upper corridor. He stood in the dark at the bottom of the stairs for longer than he would ever admit. On the fourth night, he found her. He hadn't been looking for her, or he had convinced himself he hadn't. He had gone to the estate's formal ballroom on the ground floor because it was the only room in the house that stayed genuinely cold, the northern windows never getting full sun, and sometimes when he couldn't sleep, the cold was useful. The ballroom had been closed for years. His mother had hosted parties there when Dante was a child, back when the Vescari name had still been building its power, and his father had needed to perform a particular kind of civilized legitimacy for Rome's establishment. After she died, no one had opened it. The piano was still there. A Bösendorfer, his mother's, covered in a linen dropcloth that had accumulated a decade of dust at the edges. Dante lifted the cloth from the keys without removing it entirely, the way he always did, and sat down on the bench. He played the only piece he still remembered completely, the last one his mother had taught him, a Chopin nocturne that she had said suited his temperament because it was melancholy but not weak. He played it badly, and he knew it, his left hand a full measure behind where it should be, his touch too heavy in the passages that wanted delicacy. He had never been a pianist. He had only ever been a son sitting beside his mother on this bench, learning by proximity something about grace. He played it through once. Then he stopped. "That's the B-flat minor," said a voice from the doorway. Dante didn't turn around. He knew the voice. "Opus 9, number 1, Alara said. "She taught you that?" "Don't ask about things you weren't invited to know." A pause, then quietly, "I wasn't trying to intrude. I heard it from the corridor." He said nothing. After a moment he heard her footsteps, soft, careful, and then she stopped, and he understood from the sound that she had noticed something on the far wall. He heard the slight intake of breath that someone makes when they recognize something unexpected. He turned. She was standing in front of the portrait. It had been there so long that Dante had long since stopped registering it consciously. A large oil, 18th century, depicting a woman in formal dress whose face had sustained significant damage from a water leak years ago. The pigment had bloomed and cracked across the right side of her face, obscuring everything from the cheekbone up. It looked, Dante had always thought, like someone had tried to erase her. "This is a Gaspar Traversi," Alara said, leaning toward it slightly without touching, "or a very good follower. The damage," she tilted her head, water infiltration from above. "You can see the tide line, but the undamaged sections are extraordinary. The treatment of the lace collar alone." She paused. "Do you know who she is?" "My great-great-grandmother," Dante said. "Apparently. She deserves better than this. She's been dead for 200 years. Alara turned and looked at him. In the cold ballroom light, with her hair loose and her feet bare and the documents she'd been working on still leaving faint ink marks on the side of her right hand, she looked nothing like the polished gallery director from the photographs. She looked like someone who had been working on a problem for 4 days without sleeping enough, and who intended to keep working on it until it broke. "I could restore her," Alara said. Dante looked at the painting, then at Alara. "Why would you do that?" She held his gaze. "Because she wants to be seen as she was, not as the damage left her." She paused. "And because I need something to do with my hands while I'm here or I will lose my mind." He almost said no. The no was fully formed in his mouth, the refusal reflexive, because saying yes to something she asked for felt like erosion, felt like the beginning of something he couldn't control. "I'll have materials brought," he said. Alara nodded once and turned back to the portrait. She didn't thank him. He respected that more than he wanted to. On the 6th morning, Alara came to his study. She didn't knock. The door was open and she walked in and placed a single sheet of paper on his desk and stood back. He looked at it. It was a handwritten reconstruction, her handwriting dense and precise, mapping 4 shell companies through 3 jurisdictions, with ownership chains traced back through nominee directors to a single beneficial owner whose name he recognized from a context that had nothing to do with the Bellary family. Dante looked at the name for a long time. Then he looked up at Alara. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were doing something complicated that she wasn't quite controlling. "Where did you find this?" he said. "In the data your team gave me, the certification records from the gallery's provenance system. 3 of the phantom paintings have a common documentation source, a restoration authentication firm registered in Malta 8 years ago. The beneficial owner of that firm is not my father." She pointed to the name on the page. "I don't know who this person is to you, but they're not a Bellori." Dante set the page down carefully. He did know who that person was. He knew it immediately, in the way you know something when your body recognizes it, before your mind is willing to. The recognition came with a cold sensation that started at the back of his neck and moved down. "Leave this with me," he said. "Dante." She used his name directly, which she hadn't done before. "What I've shown you changes the picture considerably. My father may have participated in this scheme, but he didn't design it. Someone used him, used the gallery, used our infrastructure, and the person whose name is on that paper is the one who built it." She looked at him with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pleading, but lived in the territory between them. "Your brother didn't go to prison because of a Bellori. He went to prison because someone used a Bellori to get to him." The room was very quiet. "I understand that," Dante said. "Then why is my name still in the morning papers?" He held her gaze and said nothing. Alara's jaw tightened. She looked away first, which Dante understood was a choice, not a concession. She looked at the window, at the Rome skyline gray and wet beyond the glass, and when she looked back, her eyes were bright in a way that was controlled, but only barely. "My mother's name," she said quietly, "was on a scholarship at the Serbini Museum. The museum removed it yesterday. My mother died when I was 11. She spent her life building something for young artists who couldn't afford proper training." She paused. "You've taken things from me that you will never be able to give back. And I'm standing here telling you that the man who designed this is someone you trust." Dante picked up his phone. He didn't call Rocco. He sat very still for a moment, feeling the weight of what she had just said, and the weight of what he had not yet done, and the weight of the name on that paper that was now sitting on his desk and could not be unseen. Then he put his phone back down. "Stay in the estate," he said. "Don't speak to anyone outside, not yet." Something shifted in Alara's face. Not relief. Not quite. More like the expression of someone who has been running and has found, not safety exactly, but slightly less dangerous ground. She left without another word. Dante sat alone in his study and looked at the name on the paper for a long time. Outside, Rome moved through its gray morning, indifferent to the thing that had just shifted in the Vescari estate. The thing that Dante could feel changing even as he resisted it, could feel in the space between what he had done to Alara Bellori and what he now understood about who had made him do it. He had told himself the calculation was simple: blood for blood. A name for a name. He had told himself that certainty was the same as truth, that the speed of his revenge was the measure of his loyalty to his brother. He picked up the document Alara had placed on his desk. He looked at the name again, and in the absolute quiet of his study, with the rain returning against the windows and his cognac untouched, and Marco still in a cell, and Alara Bellori somewhere in the floor above him surrounded by data that was dismantling everything he thought he knew, Dante Vescari understood that he had made a catastrophic mistake, and understanding it was only the beginning of what it was going to cost him. Dante didn't sleep that night. He sat in the study until 3 in the morning with the document Alara had given him, and then he got up and walked the perimeter of the estate the way his father used to walk it, not because anything needed checking, but because movement was the only thing that kept the mind from turning on itself. The guards at the east gate nodded when he passed. Nobody asked questions. Nobody ever asked Dante Vescari questions when he walked with that particular set to his shoulders. He went back inside at 4 and poured himself 2 fingers of cognac and didn't drink it, and went to bed at 4:30 and lay on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rain, which had finally stopped, replaced by a silence so complete he could hear the blood moving in his own ears. The name on that paper was Rocco Salvi. He had known it when he saw it, had known it the way you know things that you have been unconsciously avoiding. Not a surprise, but a recognition. The kind that lands in your chest like a stone dropping into deep water. No splash, just the weight of it going down. He told himself he needed more than a handwritten reconstruction from a woman he was holding against her will. He He told himself the connection could be coincidental. A shell company registered in Malta 8 years ago, a beneficial ownership trail that his own accountants hadn't surfaced, a provenance authentication firm that nobody in the Viscari organization had ever had reason to investigate. He told himself these things carefully, one by one, the way you build a wall. The wall held until approximately 5:15 in the morning, when Dante remembered something. 8 years ago, Rocco had taken a 3-week trip to Malta. Business development, he had said. Expanding relationships with certain financial institutions that operated more flexibly in that jurisdiction. Dante's father had still been alive then, barely 2 months from the end, and Dante had been too consumed with the reality of losing his father to examine what Rocco was doing in the Mediterranean for 3 weeks. He had never thought about it again until this moment. He got up at 5:30 and went back to the study and opened his secure line and called his own financial investigator. Not the team that worked with Rocco, but a man named Ferrante, who operated independently and whose number Dante had carried in his memory for 6 years without ever using it. "I need a full beneficial ownership trace on a Maltese registration," Dante said when Ferrante picked up. "Company name is Meridia Documentation Services. I need it clean, I need it fast, and I need it run without touching any of my standard channels." A pause on the line. "How fast?" 24 hours. Another pause. "That's going to cost." "I know what it costs," Dante said. "Do it." He hung up and sat back in his chair and looked at the cognac he still hadn't touched, and finally picked it up and drank it in one swallow. It burned going down and then settled, and he sat with the burn for a moment and then put the glass down and called his brother's lawyer. Marco was allowed 1 call per week. The call had happened 3 days ago. Dante couldn't reach him directly. He left a message with the lawyer. "Tell him I'm working on it. Tell him to be patient. Tell him I haven't stopped." He didn't say, "Tell him I may have destroyed an innocent woman because I was too angry to think straight." He didn't say that yet. Yes. Rocco arrived at the estate at 9 that morning, the same time he always arrived, with the same silver-gray suit and the same unhurried walk across the courtyard that Dante had been watching for 20 years. He came through the main entrance, accepted coffee from Maria without acknowledging her, and walked directly to the study the way a man walks into a room he considers his own. Dante was behind the desk. The document Alara had given him was in the safe behind the bookcase. "How's the girl?" Rocco said, settling into the chair. "Working," Dante said. "On what?" "Her own situation, trying to figure out where her father went." Dante kept his voice level, his hands flat on the desk. "She's not causing problems." Rocco looked at him with that measuring quality, the one Dante had grown up reading as loyalty. Now he found himself reading it differently, looking for the thing underneath it. "You're letting her work?" "Giving her something to do keeps her cooperative." "Cooperative," Rocco repeated the word slowly. "Dante, she's leverage, not a colleague. I'm aware of what she is." "Are you?" Rocco set his coffee down. "Because I've heard 3 different things from 3 different people this week about how you're managing this situation, and none of the 3 things sound like the way your father would have managed it." Dante looked at him. "My father's dead." "I know that." Rocco's voice was flat. "I was there." The room was quiet for a moment. "The press cycle is holding," Rocco said, shifting. "The fraud narrative is solid. I've had 2 prosecutors reach out privately to say they're not inclined to pursue anything against the family, given that Marco is the victim in the documented scheme. That's good news." He paused. "The girl's accounts are still frozen. Her gallery staff have all dispersed. The building is sitting empty." He paused again. "When her father surfaces, we move. Until then, everything stays exactly as it is." "And if her father doesn't surface?" Rocco spread his hands slightly. "Then the daughter carries the name indefinitely. It's not ideal, but it holds the narrative." Dante looked at him for a long moment. "She loses everything for the rest of her life based on a narrative." "She's a Bellori," Rocco said. "She doesn't lose everything. She loses what a Bellori deserves to lose." He picked up his coffee again. "Don't make this complicated, Dante. You did the right thing. Your brother is going to walk out of that cell because the real liability has been transferred. That's how this works." Dante said nothing. Rocco stood. I have a meeting at 11. I'll check in this afternoon. He moved toward the door and then stopped, which was slightly unusual. Rocco did not usually stop. One more thing. My contacts in Malta tell me there's been some unusual inquiry activity around certain registration records. Probably nothing. Financial journalists sniffing around after the fraud story broke. But I wanted you to know I'm aware of it. He said it casually. He said it the way you mentioned something unimportant. Dante kept his face completely still. Good to know. Rocco left. Dante sat without moving for 60 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and texted Ferrante a single word. Faster. Alara was in the ballroom. She had moved her work there, or rather, she had divided herself between the work and the portrait, spreading the financial documents on the long side table near the windows, while the painting stood on a makeshift easel she had assembled from a storage room chair and 2 hardcover books from the estate's library. She had asked Maria for specific materials the previous afternoon: cotton swabs, distilled water, a small amount of mineral spirits, soft brushes in 2 sizes. Maria had produced all of it without checking with anyone, which told Alara something about the housekeeper's relationship with the formal chain of command in this house. Dante found her at 10:30, bent close to the portrait with a cotton swab, removing a fine layer of surface grime from the undamaged sections of the painting's background. She didn't hear him come in. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching her work. The concentration of it, the small precise movements, the way she changed the angle of the swab every few strokes to keep the cotton surface fresh. You're cleaning it before you start the inpainting, he said. She didn't startle. She finished the stroke she was making and straightened and turned. I need to see what I'm working with before I touch the damaged sections. You can't restore what you haven't read yet. She looked at him. You look like you haven't slept. I slept. She looked at him with the particular expression she had, direct, not unkind, but entirely unwilling to pretend. All right, she said, and turned back to the portrait. He walked further into the room. He didn't know why. He should have been upstairs making calls, managing what was coming. Instead, he walked to the side table and looked at the documents she had spread across it. They were covered in her handwriting. Annotations in the margins, arrows connecting figures across separate pages, small neat notations in a shorthand that was half Italian and half something he didn't recognize. She had reconstructed 3 separate transaction chains across 11 documents, each one terminating in the same Malta registration. You found more, he said. 4 more instances. She kept working on the portrait. The certification firm was used 9 times in total over a 30-month period. I can account for 5 of those uses through the gallery's legitimate provenance work, artwork that actually existed, transactions that actually happened. The other 4 are phantom certifications. Paintings that have documentation but no physical record, no exhibition history, no insurance trail. She paused. Whoever built this knew exactly how provenance documentation worked. They understood the system well enough to replicate it convincingly. This is not something a financial criminal learns in a week. This was built by someone with deep knowledge of the art world. Dante said nothing. Your brother, Alara said, is not an art world figure. No. So someone built a bridge between Marco Viscari's financial footprint and a highly specialized fraud mechanism that required detailed knowledge of a completely different world. She turned and looked at him directly. The bridge has to be a person, someone who understood both sides. Dante looked at the documents and didn't answer. Alara watched his face. She had a precise way of watching, not aggressive, not searching exactly, but thorough, the way she looked at artwork, taking inventory. You already know who it is, she said. I have a suspicion. How dangerous is the suspicion? He looked at her. Dangerous enough that I'm not going to discuss it with you. Because telling me puts me at risk, or because telling me would require you to admit something you're not ready to admit. He held her gaze for a beat too long, which was as close as he ever came to showing his hand. Go back to your work. She did. But she said very quietly, as he turned to leave, whatever you decide to do with what you know, Dante, do it fast. Because the person who built this is watching, and they know I've been looking. He stopped with his back to her. They've been watching the Malta records, she said. I put a flag in the documentation system 2 days ago. A passive marker in one of the archive files. Something only someone checking for activity would trigger. She paused. It was triggered this morning at 7:43, from inside the estate's network. The cold at the back of Dante's neck moved down into his shoulders. He didn't turn around. He stood very still for a moment, feeling the shape of what she had just told him, feeling it settle into the architecture of what he already suspected, and become something solid and terrible. "You should have told me immediately," he said. "I'm telling you now." "That's not—" He stopped. He turned around. She was watching him with those clear, tired eyes, and there was something in her expression that was not triumph, and was not fear, and was not vindication, but was some complicated mixture of all three that she had managed to hold together through a week of losing everything she had built. And he found that he could not be angry at her for the timing because she had given him something just now that was more valuable than anything his own people had produced. "Can you identify the access point?" he said. "With the right tools, yes." She looked at the laptop that had appeared on the side table 3 days ago, a concession from Dante that he had made without comment. "What I have isn't sufficient. I need access to the estate's internal network logs." "I'll have someone, not someone you don't completely trust," she said. "Whoever triggered that flag knew what to look for, which means they know this system." Dante looked at her. "Who do you trust completely?" she asked. The answer that came to him immediately was Rocco. That was the answer that would have come to him without hesitation for 20 years. It was a muscle memory answer, an answer his whole adult life had been built on. He stood with the wreckage of that answer for a moment. "My brother," he said finally. "And he's in a cell." Alara absorbed that. She didn't offer sympathy. She just nodded once and said, "Then we have to work with what we have." Town. He brought her into the estate's server room himself at 2 p.m, telling his security chief that Alara needed to verify documentation timestamps for a legal preparation, close enough to true that no one would question it. The server room was in the basement, cool and loud, with the hum of machines, lit by the blue-white glow of monitor screens. She worked for 90 minutes. He stood behind her and watched, not because he could follow all of it. Her technical fluency with network architecture was beyond his own, but because he wasn't going to leave her alone with access to his systems. That much he wasn't willing to concede. What she found took him another step down a road he had been hoping he wouldn't have to walk. The access to the flagged archive file had come from an internal IP address registered to an administrative terminal on the second floor. The terminal was assigned to the estate's financial operations office, a room used almost exclusively by Rocco when he was working at the estate. The access had lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The file had been opened, examined, and closed without modification, which was the behavior of someone confirming that the trail was being followed, not someone trying to destroy evidence, someone checking whether they needed to accelerate their timeline. "He knows you know," Dante said quietly. Alara looked up at him. "Who does?" He didn't answer. He closed the access log on the screen and said, "We're done here," and walked her back upstairs. Rocco came back at 4 p.m. Dante was in the study. He had spent the intervening 2 hours doing something he should have done a week ago. He had pulled every piece of documentation his own financial team had produced in the construction of the fraud case against Alara, and he had gone through it the way she had gone through it. Not looking for confirmation, but looking for seams. There were seams everywhere, not in the documentation itself, which was professionally assembled, but in the sourcing, in the chain of custody for how the documents had come to Dante's desk in the first place. His men had retrieved the material from a secondary server in the Bellary Gallery's IT infrastructure. Dante had been told his people had discovered that server independently during a routine sweep. He was looking now at the original report from his security team describing the discovery, and what he was reading was that the server's location had been flagged by an anonymous tip to one of his men. A tip that had come through a secure channel that only 3 people in the organization had access to. Rocco was one of the 3. When Rocco knocked and came in, Dante was sitting with his hands flat on the desk and the report face down in front of him. His face was neutral. Every muscle in his body was managing something that he was not going to let into his expression. "You went quiet this afternoon," Rocco said, sitting. My people said you took the girl to the server room. Documentation verification, Dante said. You could have had our tech team do that. I wanted to observe her process. Rocco looked at him with those careful eyes. And? She's thorough, Dante said. She found some things our people missed. What kind of things? Accounting anomalies. Additional shell layers. He paused. Nothing that changes the core picture. Rocco's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Something that contracted almost imperceptibly, a slight recalibration. All right, he said. What did she make of them? She's trying to trace her father. Rocco crossed his legs, relaxed, proprietary. I have some news on that front. A contact in Lisbon says Cesare Bellori met with 2 Brazilian nationals at a private address last week. He may be moving toward South America. If that's the direction, I can put pressure on certain channels to Rocco, Dante said. Something in the way he said the name made Rocco stop. The two men looked at each other across the mahogany desk. 20 years of shared meals, shared decisions, shared danger sat in the air between them. Dante could feel it, the weight of the history, the way it pulled at him, the way loyalty and self-preservation were suddenly pulling in opposite directions, and he had to choose which one he trusted. The anonymous tip, Dante said. The one that flagged the secondary server in the gallery. It came through the secure channel. Rocco was very still. I want to know who sent it, Dante said. I'd have to check. Don't, Dante said. Don't tell me you'd have to check. You know every communication that moves through that channel. You built the channel. The room was so quiet that the clock on the bookshelf was audible. Rocco uncrossed his legs, a small motion, barely visible. But Dante had been reading Rocco's body for 20 years, and that small motion told him everything he needed to know. I sent it, Rocco said. The words landed simply. No elaboration, no immediate explanation. Rocco said them and then sat with them, waiting to see what Dante would do. Why? Dante said. His voice was quiet, steady. He could feel his own pulse in his temples. Because your brother needed an enemy, Rocco said. Marco was getting careless. He was talking to people outside the organization, making connections that were going to draw attention. The family needed a crisis, something that would consolidate your leadership and redirect attention outward. His voice was even, almost pedagogical. I found the Belarus through a mutual contact. The father was already running a smaller scheme on the side. Nothing sophisticated, just moving money for some northern families. I gave him the architecture and the protection he needed to scale it, and I built Marco into the documentation as the external target. He paused. It was clean. It would have stayed clean. Dante said nothing. You were supposed to take the Bellori name apart publicly and then negotiate a settlement with the father that brought $40 million in reparations back to the family, Rocco continued. Marco does 8 months, gets released on the fraud victim precedent, and comes back to the family with sympathy capital that makes him untouchable. You consolidate. The organization strengthens. He looked at Dante steadily. I've been managing this family's interests for 30 years. This was management. You put my brother in a cell, Dante said. Temporarily. You destroyed a woman who had nothing to do with any of it. She's a Bellori. The name needed to carry the liability. She's 26 years old, Dante said. Her mother's name was on a scholarship. She spent her life building. She's collateral, Rocco said. Dante, listen to me. Every operation has collateral. You know this. Your father knew this. The girl is not a consideration. Dante stood up. The motion was slow, controlled, but Rocco sat up straighter in response to it, the unconscious recalibration of a man who had just seen something shift in the room's gravity. Get out of my house, Dante said. Rocco's face went very careful. You need to think about what you're doing. I have been thinking, Dante said. For 8 days I have been thinking. About Marco in a cell. About 40 million euros. About a woman who never signed those invoices and whose life I have been systematically destroying based on documentation you fed me. He came around the desk. He stopped 4 feet from Rocco, close enough to see every minute adjustment of the older man's expression. You didn't give me an enemy. You gave me a victim, and you used my brother to do it. The family? You are not the family, Dante said. You never were. Rocco looked at him for a long moment, and then something in his face changed. Not the careful exterior, but something beneath it, something older and colder, the thing that had always been there that Dante had spent 20 years calling loyalty. Be careful, Rocco said quietly. I know things about this organization that you have never needed to know. Things your father told me and not you. Distances you from uncomfortable decisions. He paused. You remove me, and those things become very uncomfortable very quickly. Then let them become uncomfortable, Dante said. Dante, I said, get out. Rocco stood. He straightened his jacket with both hands, slow and deliberate. He looked at Dante with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite regret, but carried elements of both, and then he walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. The girl found the Malta trail, he said, without turning around. I know she did. I know you've been helping her. He paused. You should ask yourself what happens to your brother's case if that trail goes public before we control the narrative. The prosecutor who has Marco isn't stupid. Public evidence of a conspiracy could go either way. He finally turned, just enough to look at Dante over his shoulder. I've been protecting this family from exactly this kind of exposure for 3 decades. Think hard about whether you want to burn that protection down. He left. Dante stood alone in his study for a full minute, not moving, feeling the shape of what had just happened and what had not yet happened but was now inevitably coming. He could feel the timeline compressing. Rocco walking out of this room was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something, and whatever it was, it would move fast. He picked up his phone and called Ferrante. Whatever you have on Meridia Documentation Services, send it now. Everything. Don't wait for the full picture. Then he walked upstairs. Ilara was in the ballroom, standing in front of the portrait with a fine brush, working a thin layer of color into the damaged edge of the painted woman's cheekbone. She had mixed the in-painting medium on a small glass palette, matching the tone with a precision that required looking between the paint and the canvas every few seconds, checking, adjusting. She heard him come in and didn't stop what she was doing. He knows, Dante said. The brush kept moving. I heard, she said quietly. He stopped. The room is not wired. No, but Maria's nephew works the East Corridor. She glanced at him. He's not your man, but he talks. Dante filed that away and moved on. Rocco is going to act. He accessed the archive flag this morning, which means he knows you've reconstructed the trail. He'll move before it becomes a liability. Move how? He has 3 options. Dante moved to the side table and looked at her documents without touching them. He destroys the evidence. He destroys the credibility of whoever holds the evidence. Or he removes the person who built the evidence trail from the equation. Ilara's brush stopped. She turned and looked at him. He means me, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she set the brush down very carefully on the palette rim and turned fully to face him. She was pale, but her voice was steady. How much time do we have? I don't know, hours, maybe less. And you? She stopped, started again. You told him to leave, you confronted him. Yes. Which means he knows that you know. She looked at him with those clear eyes and something moved through them. Not gratitude, not yet, but something that was adjacent to it, something that recognized the weight of what he had just done. You burned it down. I burned it down, he said. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at the portrait, the woman whose face was still half recovered, the undamaged side emerging from the canvas with sudden clarity, while the restored section glowed with fresh color. She looked at it for a moment, and then she picked up the brush again. I need 2 more hours to secure what I've built, she said. The complete network reconstruction, all of it, in a format that can survive without my testimony. I'll give you what you need, Dante said. She looked at him once more briefly, and the look between them was the kind that happens between 2 people who have been circling each other in the dark and have suddenly found themselves standing in the same small circle of light, neither of them having planned to be there. Then she went back to the portrait. and Dante went to the door and called two men he trusted absolutely and began preparing for the thing that was no longer avoidable, the confrontation that Rocco's departure had made inevitable, that Alara's evidence had made necessary, and that Dante's own choices, the choices he had made in rage and certainty 8 days ago in this very house, had set in. Motion was the only thing that kept Dante from coming apart. He moved through the estate with the two men he trusted, Gio and Benedetto, brothers from Napoli who had worked Vescari security for 11 years, and who understood without being told that when Dante walked with that particular silence, the correct response was to match it. Mapping exits, checking communication lines, pulling the estate's internal camera feeds onto a tablet that Benedetto carried without comment. The grounds were still. The guards at the perimeter were Dante's people, not Rocco's, which gave him the outer ring. The interior was more complicated. Rocco had spent 20 years moving through this building, and a man who spends 20 years in a house learns its geometry better than its owner. At 5:40 in the afternoon, Dante's phone received a file from Ferrante. He stopped in the east corridor and opened it. The beneficial ownership trace on Meridia Documentation Services in Malta was complete. The company had been registered 8 years and 3 months ago. The listed beneficial owner was a Maltese nominee. A standard arrangement, legally unremarkable, but behind the nominee, disclosed only in a second-tier filing that required access to the Maltese Financial Intelligence Authority's confidential register, was a trust structure registered in Liechtenstein. The trust had 3 beneficiaries. The first was Rocco Salvi. The second was Cesare Bellori. The third was a name Dante had to read twice before his mind accepted it, Magistrate Aurelio Conti of the Rome Criminal Division. Aurelio Conti was the magistrate currently overseeing Marco Viscari's detention. Dante stood in the corridor with the phone in his hand and felt the floor of the world drop out from under him in the specific way it does when you understand that the trap is not the thing you have been fighting. The trap is the entire room. Marco wasn't being held because of insufficient evidence. Marco was being held because the man who controlled the decision to hold him was a partner in the scheme that had put him there. Conti would keep Marco in that cell for as long as Rocco needed him there. And if Rocco felt cornered, if he felt Dante closing in, Conti had the authority to make Marco's situation considerably worse before it got better. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. You should have left it alone. Now the brother pays. He called Gio over and showed him the message without speaking. Gio read it, looked up, said nothing. Dante typed back, "Touch my brother and I will burn everything you built. Not just the structure, everything." No response came. He pocketed the phone and walked faster. Oh, Alara was still in his ballroom, but she wasn't working on the portrait anymore. She was at the side table with the laptop, assembling the reconstruction she'd promised. A single consolidated document, thoroughly sourced, that mapped the entire network from the phantom paintings through the shell companies, through Meridia, through the Liechtenstein Trust. She had her back to the door and didn't hear Dante come in, and for a moment he stood there watching her work with a focus so complete she might as well have been alone in the world. "Conti," he said. She stopped typing. Her shoulders tightened. "Magistrate Aurelio Conti," he said again. "He's the third partner." She turned slowly. Her face went through something in the space of 2 seconds that was painful to watch. Recognition. Then the specific nausea of understanding. Then something that settled into a stillness that Dante was beginning to recognize as the face she wore when she was absorbing something that would have broken a different person. "Conti has been assigned to Marco's case since day 1, she said. "Yes." "So Marco's never getting out," she said. "Not through legitimate channels, not while Conti holds the case. Not without removing Conti from the equation first." She looked at him. "How?" "The evidence," he said. "What you've built. If it reaches the right people before Rocco can contain it." "Who are the right people?" she said, and her voice carried something sharp in it now, something that had run out of patience with abstractions. "Because you just told me the magistrate overseeing your brother is a partner in the fraud, which means the judiciary is compromised. Your organization, you've already told me Rocco has 30 years of infrastructure inside it. Your media contacts assembled the story against me, which means Rocco has reached there too." She stood up from the table. Where exactly does this evidence go that Rocco can't intercept it? Dante didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Ilara walked toward him. She stopped 4 feet away, close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her face. The kind that goes past the body into something deeper. The kind that comes from 8 days of losing things with no floor in sight. You told Rocco to get out. You confronted him, which means you made a move without having the next 3 moves planned. I had a timeline, Dante said. He accelerated it. By how much? His jaw tightened. He texted me 20 minutes ago. He said Marco pays. Something moved through Ilara's face that she didn't manage to suppress. It was there for 1 second, and then it was gone, replaced by that controlled stillness. But Dante had seen it. She had reacted to the threat against Marco the way you react to something that lands personally, not abstractly. And he found himself slightly undone by that, by the fact that after everything he had done to her, she still flinched at the threat of damage to someone she'd never met. How long before he moves, she said. I don't know, an hour, maybe less. Then we need to move first. She turned back to the laptop. I'm 20 minutes from finishing this document. When it's complete, it needs to go to 3 separate recipients simultaneously, not through your channels and not through anything Rocco has touched. We need a journalist, someone with an established reputation who works independently, and a prosecutor, someone outside Rome jurisdiction who has reason to want Conti's head. I can get those names, Dante said. Can you get them in 20 minutes? He was already on his phone. Done. The next 18 minutes were the tightest of Dante's life, and his life had contained some very tight minutes. He worked the phone from the ballroom doorway while Ilara finished the document, pulling in 2 contacts he had kept entirely separate from Rocco's sphere. A financial crimes prosecutor in Milan named Caruso, whom Dante knew from a legal matter 6 years ago and who had no love for the Rome judiciary, and a journalist named Ginevra Rule, who had broken 3 major institutional corruption stories in the last decade and who operated out of a small independent bureau in Bologna with no corporate ownership and no political alignment. He reached Caruso first. He gave him 3 sentences, the name Conti, the word Malta, and the phrase Viscari fraud conspiracy. And Caruso was quiet for 4 seconds and then said, "Send it encrypted. I'll have a receiving address to you in 5 minutes." He reached Rule second. She was harder. She asked twice where the material was sourced and who had assembled it, and when Dante told her it had been reconstructed by the director of the Bellori Gallery, Rule said, "The woman your organization burned in the press last week?" And Dante said yes, and there was a pause that felt evaluative, and then Rule said, "If the sourcing is solid, I can have it on the wire within an hour of receipt." "The sourcing is solid," Dante said. "Is it your people saying that or hers?" "Hers," he said. "It's entirely hers." Another pause. "All right," Rule said. "Send it." Ilara finished the document at 6:17. She had compressed 9 days of financial reconstruction into 41 pages of sourced, annotated analysis, the kind of document that was either the work of a sophisticated fraudster constructing a misdirection or the work of an exceptionally meticulous innocent person trying to prove their own innocence. And the difference between those 2 readings was in the details, and the details were airtight. She handed Dante the laptop. He transferred the file to Caruso's encrypted address and to Rule's secure upload portal. Both transmissions confirmed receipt at 6:22. Ilara stood beside him and watched the confirmation screens and let out a breath that she had been holding for approximately the last 3 hours. "Now we wait," she said. "Now we don't wait," Dante said. "Now we move you somewhere that isn't this building." She looked at him. "Where?" "I have a property outside the city. 40 minutes. Nothing on paper that connects it to the main estate." He was already closing the laptop. "Get what you need." "I have nothing," she said. "You took everything I had." The words weren't weaponized. She said them the way you state a fact about weather, but they landed in Dante's chest with a precision that all the deliberately cruel things she could have said would not have matched, and he stood for a moment with the simple weight of them. "Then there's nothing to pack," he said. "Let's go." They were in the corridor when the lights went out. But not a circuit failure. The backup generators kicked on in less than 4 seconds, which meant the estate's security system rerouted power on emergency protocol. But in those 4 seconds, Every camera on the estate's internal network went dark, and every electronic lock in the building cycled into its default failsafe position, which on the Viscari estate, designed by a security architect who had prioritized lockdown over evacuation, meant that every interior door locked. Dante had the override code. He punched it into the panel beside the east corridor door. Nothing happened. "He's in the system," Gio said from behind him. His voice was flat and professional. "How?" Dante said. "Override at the source. He'd need access to the main security node." Gio looked at him. "It's in the basement." "Where's Benedetto?" "West corridor. He won't be able to reach us." Alara said nothing. She stood close to the wall in the corridor's emergency lighting, red-tinged, harsh, and watched Dante with a focused attention that wasn't panic. He was aware of her looking, aware of being watched by someone who was taking accurate inventory of whether he could handle what was happening, and the awareness sharpened him. "The ballroom windows," he said, "north face, they open onto the outer garden. We go through there, around the east wall, to the vehicle access on the service road." He looked at Gio. "Can you reach the service road contact?" Gio was already on his radio. "Trying." Static. "Jammers," Gio said. Dante's phone had no signal. Alara's, which had been returned to her 3 days ago, a concession Dante had made without examining why, showed the same. No cellular signal, no wireless. The building was an electronic island. Rocco had not been improvising. This was planned. The confrontation in the study, the text message about Marco, none of it had been reaction, it had been management. Rocco had been running this timeline from the moment he triggered the archive flag at 7:43 that morning, and Dante had been working from a position of disadvantage without knowing it. He made himself breathe. "Ballroom," he said. "Move." They went back through the corridor, Gio leading, Dante behind Alara with one hand near the small of her back. Not touching her, just near, close enough to push her forward if the situation required it. The emergency lighting made the estate's corridors look like the inside of something organic, all red shadow and geometric angles. The ballroom windows were large, arched, set low enough that the sill was at hip height. Dante unlatched the nearest one and pushed it open, and the night air came in cool and heavy with the smell of wet stone. And he helped Alara over the sill and followed her. And then Gio came after, and they were on the outer terrace. The estate grounds were dark. The perimeter lighting had gone with the main power, and the garden was a landscape of shadow and mass. The boxwood hedges, the gravel paths, the stone wall at the eastern boundary. Dante knew this ground by feel. He had run it as a child, hiding from his father's dinner parties in the spaces between the hedges, and the memory of the geometry was somewhere in his body below conscious thought. He led them along the north face of the building, hugging the wall, moving fast but not running. Running was noise. Running was exposure. He could feel Alara's presence just behind his left shoulder, her breath controlled, her footsteps matching his rhythm without being told to. They were 20 meters from the east wall gate when a light came on. Not the estate's own lighting, a handheld torch, military grade from the direction of the south garden. And then a second, and the sound of movement in the gravel that was multiple people, spread out, moving to cut off the most obvious routes to the perimeter. Rocco had people inside the grounds. Dante stopped. Gio was beside him immediately, close, with the compact assurance of someone for whom this kind of situation is a professional reality. He leaned in close. 3, maybe 4. They're covering the east gate and the service road junction. How did they get past the perimeter guards? Gio's silence was the answer. The perimeter guards. Some of them, at least. Not all of Dante's people were still his people. Another thing he hadn't known. Another piece of Rocco's 30-year infrastructure operating below the surface. Alara pressed herself against the wall beside Dante. She was looking at the lights moving in the south garden, tracking them, calculating. He could see her doing it. The same focused inventory she brought to damaged paintings and fraudulent invoices applied now to the immediate problem of not dying in the garden of the house that had been holding her prisoner. "There's a drainage channel," she said quietly, "along the base of the east wall. It runs to a service grate about 30 meters north of the main gate." Dante looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I spent 8 days looking at every part of this property I could see from any window I was permitted to stand near," she said without heat. People who are held somewhere involuntarily tend to map their environment. He had no response to that. The grate opens inward, she continued. I could see the hinge orientation from the second-floor east window. It's the kind of maintenance access that's on the original architectural plans but doesn't appear in standard security sweeps because it predates the modern system by about 60 years. Gio looked at Dante. Dante said, "Take us there, us." The drainage channel was exactly where she said it was, and the grate opened exactly as she had described, and they came out on the service road on the north side of the estate wall with mud on their knees and the sound of movement inside the grounds behind them. Dante had Gio go ahead to check the road while he and Alara waited in the shadow of the wall. The road was clear. No vehicles, no watchers. Rocco's people had concentrated on the obvious exits. Gio flagged them forward. They moved along the service road at a pace that was almost a jog, Alara keeping up without complaint, her charcoal coat dark enough in the night to help, her breath coming slightly harder now, but controlled. 200 meters up the road was a farm storage building that Dante had used exactly once, 4 years ago, as a fallback position after a meeting went wrong. He had told no one in the organization about it. He had paid for it in cash through a name that existed only in a single notarial record in a small office in the Castelli Romani. The building was unlocked. It smelled of old motor oil and hay. Inside was a 10-year-old Alfa Romeo under a tarp, with a tank that was 2/3 full because Dante had filled it the last time he was here. And the last time he was here, nothing had happened, and he had left and not thought about it again. He pulled the tarp off. Gio took the driver's side without being asked. Dante opened the passenger door for Alara. She stopped before getting in. She stood in the dark of the storage building and looked at him directly, and in the near-total absence of light, her face was mostly shadow, but her eyes caught something. "The document is sent," she said. "Caruso has it. Rule has it. Whatever happens to us now, Alara, whatever happens to us now," she repeated firmly, "the evidence exists. Rocco cannot put it back in the box." She paused. "That was the only thing that mattered tonight. I need you to understand that I know it was the only thing that mattered." He held her gaze. He understood that she was not saying this to reassure him. She was saying it to clarify her own position, to make it clear that if the situation became one in which his safety and hers came into conflict with the evidence, she had already made her choice. "Get in the car," he said. She got in the car. They were on the road south of Rome within 12 minutes. Sit. Dante's phone regained signal 6 kilometers from the estate. In the 30 minutes since they had gone dark, he had missed 9 calls. 4 from numbers he didn't recognize. 2 from his lawyer. 1 from the prison facility where Marco was being held. 1 from Ferrante. And 1 from a Rome number that he recognized after a moment as the main line of the criminal division, Conti's office. He listened to the voicemail from Marco's facility first. A duty officer's voice, formal and slightly apologetic, informing him that Marco Viscari had been transferred from his current facility to a high-security detention center outside Rome pending a reclassification of charges. The reclassification had been signed by Magistrate Conti at 5:50 that afternoon. The new charges elevated Marco from fraud suspect to potential co-conspirator in an organized crime investigation. Dante put the phone in his lap. He looked at the road ahead through the windshield, the headlights cutting a pale cone through the dark, the farmland outside Rome sliding past on both sides, flat and lightless and indifferent. In the seat beside him, Alara had heard. The facility voicemail had been loud enough. She sat without saying anything, looking at her hands in her lap, and Dante was aware of her stillness in the way you're aware of pressure, something containing itself by significant effort. He moved Marco to justify the investigation reclassification, Dante said. His voice was very quiet, which means Marco is no longer a fraud victim. He's a suspect in an organized crime case, which means the evidence you've assembled, the evidence exonerating him, now has to work against a different charge architecture. Alara said, Caruso's office covers organized crime. Yes. Then the material is still relevant. It is, he paused. But Rocco has bought time. Conti can hold Marco in the new facility for 60 days without a bail hearing under the reclassification protocol. 60 days during which the evidence we've sent has to move through official channels that Conti will work to slow. Alara was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "Rule, the journalist." Dante looked at her. "Caruso works inside the system," she said. "Conti can slow the system, but Rule works outside it. If she publishes the public pressure, Rule said she could have it on the wire within an hour of receipt." Dante looked at his watch. "She received it 47 minutes ago." He called her. The phone rang 4 times, then Rule's voicemail picked up. He left a message. His voice stayed level. He said there had been developments and the situation was accelerating and to please publish everything she had as soon as possible and not to wait for his confirmation. He hung up and called again immediately. Voicemail again. Gio caught his eye in the rearview mirror, said nothing. Dante called Ferrante. Ferrante picked up on the second ring. "The journalist," Dante said. "Geneva Rule, Bologna. I need you to confirm she's active." A pause. Typing. "When did you last have contact?" 48 minutes ago, by upload." More typing. A longer pause than Dante liked. "I'm not seeing anything. Her bureau's publication system shows no activity since this morning." A pause. "Her personal mobile is showing no response to network pings." The cold at the back of Dante's neck returned. "Her location?" "Last tower registration was in Bologna 90 minutes ago." A pause. "That's before your transmission." Dante processed this in the space of 2 breaths. Geneva Rule had been off-network for 90 minutes. She had gone dark before he sent the document, which meant she had not received it, which meant the secure upload portal he had used. "The upload portal," he said. "Can you check the portal's receiving status?" Ferrante was already on it. When he came back, his voice had changed slightly. "The portal is returning a legitimate confirmation, but the underlying delivery address resolves to a proxy. Your file was received, logged, and then rerouted." A pause. "Dante, someone replaced the receiving end of that portal. The upload went to a box that isn't Rules." Dante closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, the road was the same. The night was the same. Alara was watching him from the passenger seat with an expression that had moved past fear into something more fundamental, the expression of someone who has been playing a game and has just realized the board was different than they thought. "Rocco has the document," Dante said. Her breath came out slowly. "And Caruso?" He called Caruso. It rang once and went to a message that was not Caruso's voicemail but an automated network response, indicating the number was temporarily unavailable. "Caruso's line is blocked," he said. The car moved through the dark. Gio drove without commenting. Outside, the farmland had given way to the first outlined suburbs of the eastern fringe, scattered lights, low buildings, gas stations closed for the night. Dante sat with the full weight of it. The evidence was gone. Not destroyed, but controlled. Rocco had the document, which meant he knew exactly what it contained, which meant he could prepare his responses to every element of it before anyone used it against him. Rule was unreachable, compromised or silenced or simply cut off from the communication lines that would allow her to publish. Caruso was blocked. Marco was reclassified and transferred. The estate was occupied by Rocco's people. And Dante was in a 10-year-old car heading for a fallback property with a woman he had spent 8 days destroying, 2 bodyguards, and approximately nothing else. Alara spoke. Her voice was low, and she was looking straight ahead through the windshield when she said it. "There's a backup." Dante turned to her. "The reconstruction document," she said. "The version I sent you, Beps. That was the assembled file. Clean, formatted, ready for legal and journalistic use." She paused. "But the source data is still on the estate server. Your financial team's copies, the server logs, my annotation files, everything I used to build that document still exists in the systems inside that building. Rocco controls the building. He controls the locks and the network access," she said. "He doesn't control what's on the servers, not yet. Deleting 9 days of financial data from a system that size takes time. You have to do it correctly, or forensic recovery pulls it back. If he moves too fast, he leaves traces. If he moves carefully, he needs hours. We don't have hours." "We have one," she said. "Maybe. If we move right now. She turned and looked at him fully, and in the passing lights of the suburban road, her face was clear and set. The gala. He stared at her. You have a charity gala scheduled at the estate, she said. Day after tomorrow. I saw the preparation schedule on the estate calendar system when I was in the server room. 230 guests, Rome's political establishment, judiciary, financial sector. You've been planning it for 6 months. She held his gaze. We don't need Caruso and we don't need Rule. We need 230 people in that building simultaneously, with phones and cameras, while the evidence is still on the servers. The silence in the car was absolute. You want to walk back into that building, Dante said. I want to walk into that building in front of 230 witnesses, she said, with everything I know, and say it out loud. She paused. Rocco will be there. He has to be there. Canceling would draw attention he doesn't want while the situation is still fluid. He'll think he has the document contained. He won't expect us to come back. Dante looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Gio glanced in the rearview mirror again, checking. If it goes wrong, Dante said. If it goes wrong, we're no worse than we are right now, Ilara said. Your brother is in a maximum security facility on reclassified charges. My evidence is in Rocco's hands. You have no media contact, no prosecutorial contact, and no functioning base of operations. She paused. We have nothing left to lose that we haven't already lost. Dante sat with that. He thought about Marco. Marco's face across a dinner table, wine-stained tablecloth, that embarrassed laugh. Marco, who had trusted him with his whole chest his entire life. He thought about Ilara's mother's name on a scholarship that no longer existed. He thought about the portrait in the ballroom, the woman whose face was half recovered, the careful work of restoration that Ilara had been doing by lamplight in a house that was her prison, and what it meant that she had done it anyway. He thought about what Rocco had said in the study. You needed an enemy. I gave you the girl. And what he thought, underneath all of it, the thing that had been building since the moment he had seen her go through those fraudulent invoices with a precision that made his certainty feel like the thing it actually was, which was vanity, which was pride dressed up as justice, was that he had been the instrument of a man who considered other people's lives administrative material. He had been that instrument willingly, and the only currency he had left that was worth anything was the decision about what he was going to do about it. Turn around, Dante said to Gio. Gio didn't hesitate. He took the next intersection and turned the car back toward Rome, back toward the estate and whatever Rocco had waiting inside it, and the headlights swept across the dark farmland in a wide arc and settled onto the road heading west. Ilara sat very still in the passenger seat. She didn't say anything. She put her hands flat on her knees and looked at the road ahead and breathed steadily, the way someone breathes when they have made a decision that cannot be unmade and have accepted what comes with it. Dante looked at her profile in the passing light and understood, with a clarity that had been building for 9 days and had now arrived complete and irreversible, that the worst thing he had ever done was also the thing that was going to define everything that came after. Not because she would allow it to define her, but because he was not going to allow it to define him. And the difference between those two positions was the only thing he had left that resembled. They drove back toward Rome without headlights for the last 2 kilometers. Gio knew the roads, had grown up 30 minutes south of the city, and had the particular intimacy with these back routes that comes from a childhood spent finding ways in and out of places without being seen. He cut the lights at the top of the hill above the estate and let the car roll on momentum and gravity, steering by the ambient glow of the city beyond and the thin sliver of moon that had appeared between the cloud breaks sometime after midnight. Dante sat in the passenger seat with his eyes on the estate below. The main building lit from within, the grounds dark, 2 vehicles he didn't recognize parked on the service road near the east gate. Rocco had consolidated. He had probably moved his core people inside in the hours since Dante and Ilara had come through the drainage grate and disappeared into the dark. The gala was in 31 hours. That was the timeline they were working against. Not because the gala was the only option. Dante had spent the 40-minute drive back running every other option he had and finding them all compromised or closed or dependent on resources that Rocco had already neutralized. The gala was the option because it was the one thing Rocco could not cancel without creating exactly the kind of attention he needed to avoid while the evidence situation was still fluid. 230 guests, senators, financiers, 3 sitting judges from outside Rome's jurisdiction, a deputy minister of cultural affairs who happened to be a personal enemy of Magistrate Conti and who had been looking for leverage against him for 2 years. It was the option because Alara had thought of it, and Alara had been right about everything she had thought of so far. And Dante had stopped pretending that was a coincidence. Gio stopped the car in the shadow of the farm building where they'd started and cut the engine. Nobody spoke for a moment. 2 on the east gate, Gio said. I can't see the south perimeter from here. There'll be 2 more on the south, Dante said. Rocco runs in pairs. The drainage channel? He'll have found it. Dante looked at the building. We're not going back through the grounds tonight. We don't have to. Alara was leaning forward slightly from the back seat, looking at the estate through the space between the front seats. The gala preparation, she said. Catering crews, florists, lighting contractors. They start arriving at 6 in the morning. Day of staff starts at noon. By 6 in the evening, there are going to be service vehicles and external contractors moving through that property in numbers that Rocco cannot fully control without making it obvious to 230 guests that something is wrong. He'll have people inside who look like guests, Dante said. How many can he credibly place without it looking like what it is? She said. 8, 10? You have a 230-person gala in a building where the host is the person he's trying to contain. If he floods it with his people, the guests notice. If he doesn't, he has gaps. She paused. We go in with the catering staff. We use the gap. And once we're inside? She looked at him steadily. I finish what I started in the server room. I get back into the system, pull the source data, and push it directly to every journalist and prosecutor contact I can reach independently. Not through portals, not through upload systems that can be intercepted. Direct email, direct contact, old-fashioned digital distribution to 30 recipients simultaneously. She paused. And you take the stage. Dante turned and looked at her fully. The gala has a program, she said. You're scheduled to speak at 9:15. Remarks from the host, standard philanthropic language, donation acknowledgments. You take that microphone and you say what you told me in the study, about Marco, about Rocco, about what you did to me, in front of every camera and every phone in that room. You say it before Rocco can move while 230 people are watching, and you say all of it. The silence in the car was the kind that has mass. That destroys the organization, Dante said. Everything my father built, everything... It's already destroyed, Alara said. Rocco destroyed it when he decided to use it as a personal instrument. You're deciding what happens to the pieces. Dante looked at the estate. At the lit windows, the dark grounds, the shape of the building against the Roman night. The building his grandfather had bought with money that had never been clean, that his father had expanded with more of the same, that Dante had inherited and administered and defended, and that had over the course of 34 years and 100 decisions that each seemed necessary in isolation become the architecture of everything he had been taught to call his life. He looked at it for a long time. All right, he said. So what? They spent the night in the farm building, taking turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts on a wooden bench that was barely wide enough for one person. Gio and Benedetto, who had found them via a route Gio had arranged through 3 intermediary contacts, arriving at 2 in the morning with dried food from a service station and the information that 4 of the estate's perimeter guards had been replaced by Rocco's people, kept watch from the building's high window. Dante didn't sleep during his shift. He sat on the concrete floor with his back against the wall and his phone, signal intermittent out here, and worked through the logistics of what tomorrow required with the methodical focus that was the only form of control he had left. He needed one contact inside the gala's catering company. He had it, a man named Bruni, who had worked event catering for the Viscari estate for 11 years, and who owed Dante a debt of the personal variety that had nothing to do with the organization. He texted Bruni at 3 in the morning and received a response by 4. I understand. Staff credentials for 2 by 8 a.m. He needed Alara to have physical access to the estate's server room, which was in the basement, which had a single entry point from the main corridor. Once the gala was underway, the basement would be used for catering staging. Catering staff would be moving through that corridor continuously from 6 in the evening onward. It was achievable. He needed 30 minutes at the server room terminal, which Alara said was enough. He needed to get to the stage at 9:15. He needed not to be shot before he reached the microphone. That last item was the one he sat with longest. At 6:40 in the morning, with the sky going from black to gray to the specific pale gold of a Roman dawn, Alara sat down beside him on the concrete floor without being asked. She had slept 2 hours. She looked it, not undone, but stripped of the layer of presentation that people carry when they've had enough rest to maintain it. Just the actual face of her, which was sharp and tired and entirely present. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Marco," she said. "Tell me about him." Dante looked at her. "Not for me," she said. "For you. You've been carrying this alone for 9 days. What's he like?" He looked at the far wall of the farm building for a moment. Outside, the first birds were starting. "He's better than me," Dante said finally. "Has been since we were children. He has a quality. Not softness, that's not the word. A quality of actually seeing people. You talk to Marco, he's listening to you, not to what he's going to say next. It's rare." He paused. "He should never have been part of any of this. I kept him adjacent to the organization because I thought proximity meant protection. I was wrong about that." Alara was quiet. "He sends flowers to our mother's grave every Sunday," Dante said. "He's been doing it for 9 years. I've been to the grave 4 times. He stopped. The words had gotten somewhere he hadn't intended them to go, and he pulled back from the edge of it and looked at her. "Why did you ask?" "Because you're about to risk your life for him tonight," she said. "And I wanted to know if you were doing it out of obligation or because you actually love him." The question sat in the air between them. "Both," Dante said. She nodded once, as if that was the right answer, or at least an honest one. She looked at the gray light coming through the high window. "I had a professor," she said, "who told me that restoration is not the same as recovery. Recovery means returning something to what it was. Restoration means revealing what it still is, underneath the damage." She paused. "I've been thinking about that distinction for 9 days. He didn't answer, but he looked at her, and she looked back. And in the quiet of the farm building, with the dawn coming in gray and gold, and the day that might break everything standing a few hours ahead of them, there was a moment that was not romantic, and was not resolved, and was not safe, but was real in the specific way that things become real when all the performance has been stripped away by circumstances that don't care about performance. Then Alara stood and said, "I need to review the server room layout before we go in." And the moment closed, and they went back to work. They entered the estate at 6:53 in the morning in the back of a catering van, under staff credentials that Bruni had left in a case at the service entrance. White shirts, black trousers, the anonymous uniform of event infrastructure. Gio drove. Benedetto was already inside, had gone in through the service entrance an hour earlier under a separate pretext that Dante trusted him to have managed. The guards at the service gate were 2 men Dante didn't recognize, which confirmed what Gio had reported about the perimeter replacements. They checked credentials, swept the van with a practiced efficiency that was professional but not inspired, and waved them through. The estate's interior was controlled chaos in the specific way of high-end event preparation. Florists moving through the main hall with impossible quantities of white flowers, lighting contractors on ladders adjusting the chandelier rigs, catering staff setting up the long tables in the east reception rooms. The noise and motion created exactly the kind of coverage that Dante had counted on. He moved through it with his head slightly down, the white shirt doing its work, and nobody looked at him twice because nobody looks at catering staff twice. Alara was beside him. She had her hair pinned differently, pulled back tight, and the white shirt made her look younger and simultaneously more determined. And Dante was aware of her in the peripheral way he had been aware of her for 9 days, constantly, precisely, without being able to fully account for it. They separated at the east staircase. She went down to the basement. He went toward the central corridor where Benedetto was waiting near the coat room with 2 additional staff shirts, 2 additional credentials, and the information that Rocco had arrived at 7:15 and was currently in the estate's formal dining room with 3 men Benedetto recognized from Rocco's private operation. Dante checked the time. 9 hours until he needed to be at the microphone. 9 hours was a very long time. It was also no time at all. Bishop. Alara reached the server room at 7:22. The basement corridor was already being used for catering staging, crates of glassware, folded linens, rolling racks of tableware. She moved through it with purpose, carrying a clipboard she had picked up from an unattended catering station. And nobody asked her anything because a woman with a clipboard moving with purpose in a service corridor is indistinguishable from someone who belongs there. The server room door had an electronic lock that ran on the estate's main security system, the same system Rocco had taken over the night before. She stood in front of it for 3 seconds and then opened the maintenance panel beside the door, which was a physical key override that had existed in the original building plans and that she had noted during her initial visit 2 days ago. The key was on a hook inside the panel. Buildings this old always had this redundancy. Architects from the previous century didn't trust electronics because electronics hadn't existed long enough to be trustworthy. She unlocked the door and went in. The room was the same, cool, humming, the blue-white monitor glow. She sat down at the main terminal and logged in with the administrator credentials she had memorized during her previous session, and the system responded and she was in. She had 30 minutes, she had told Dante. She'd been optimistic. What she actually had was 20, because the data she needed was distributed across 4 separate archive nodes, and pulling it into a single exportable package required navigating a file architecture that was organized by someone who valued obscurity over functionality. She started with the Meridia documentation files. Upstairs at 9:45 in the morning, Dante came face to face with Rocco. It wasn't planned. Dante was moving through the east corridor toward the kitchen staging area. He had been doing circuits of the building, learning the new positions of Rocco's people, building the map he would need for tonight. When Rocco came around the corner from the main hall, and they were 6 feet apart before either of them had time to recalculate. Rocco stopped. Dante stopped. 3 feet of high-ceilinged Roman corridor between them, florist boxes stacked against the wall to the right, the sound of somebody's radio playing something classical from 2 rooms over. Rocco looked at him for a long moment. His face went through something. Not surprise, exactly. More like the expression of a chess player who has been tracking an opponent's position and has just had a move confirmed that he expected but had hoped wouldn't come. "You came back," Rocco said. "I came back," Dante said. "That was stupid." "Probably." Rocco glanced at the corridor behind Dante, then at the one behind himself. Calculating coverage, Dante understood, checking whether the moment had witnesses. "The document is gone," Rocco said quietly. "The upload was rerouted before your journalist ever saw it. Whatever the girl built, I have it." "I know," Dante said. "And you still came back." "I came back." Rocco looked at him with something that might, on a different face in a different life, have been close to sadness. "You're going to destroy everything your father built," he said. "For a woman whose family tried to rob you, for a brother who would have cost you more than he was worth inside this organization within 5 years. "Stop," Dante said. "Dante, I've been running the Vescari operation since before you were old enough to understand what it was," Rocco said. His voice was still low, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Not quite anger, more like the conviction of a man who has spent decades believing his own framework. "I have protected this family from 20 things you never knew were coming. I have made decisions that kept you alive and solvent and powerful, and the costs of those decisions are mine to account for, not yours." "You put an innocent woman's name in the papers," Dante said. "You took her mother's memorial off a museum wall. You put my brother in a cell and then reclassified his charges when you felt threatened." He paused. "Every one of those decisions is mine to account for now. Because I was your instrument, Rocco, and I didn't know it, and that ends tonight." Rocco looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I can't let you take that stage." "I know that too." The corridor was very still. Rocco reached into his jacket, not quickly, deliberately, with the measured motion of a man who has done difficult things for a long time and has never been hurried by them, and removed his phone. He made a call. One word. Now. And then it wasn't still anymore. Chump. They came from the east staircase and the kitchen corridor simultaneously. 4 men, Rocco's people, moving with the specific efficiency of people who have been briefed and positioned and have been waiting. Not for Dante specifically, Dante understood in the first second of the confrontation. They had been positioned at these intersections since morning because Rocco had anticipated this and had placed his people at the choke points and had simply waited for Dante to walk into one. 30 years of management. This was what it looked like. Dante moved before they were fully in position. He went left into the east staircase before the 2 men from that direction had cleared the door frame, which meant they were on the wrong side of the momentum, and he had a half-second advantage that he used immediately. Shoulder into the nearer man, hard, using body weight rather than technique, driving him back into the second man and buying himself the staircase. He went up. Not the obvious direction, but the only one available. Behind him he heard Rocco's voice, controlled and cold. Quietly, no shooting in the house. Not tonight. Right. Not tonight. 230 guests arriving in 11 hours. Gunshots were bad for the ambiance. Dante hit the second-floor landing and went right, toward the part of the estate that he knew and Rocco's people might not. The old family wing, which had been closed for most of his adult life and which had a secondary staircase at the far end that opened onto the east terrace, the same terrace that connected to the ballroom. He needed to get to the ballroom, because in the ballroom there was something that Rocco had not thought to remove because Rocco had not known to think about it. The old ventilation control panel that Dante's mother had shown him when he was 9 years old during a game of hide-and-seek that had lasted 3 hours because Dante had found the one room in the building that the adults couldn't reach without the specific key that his mother kept on a ribbon around her wrist, and which she had given to him on her deathbed, with no explanation beyond keep it safe, and which Dante had kept in the lining of his wallet for 25 years without ever using it because he had never needed it. He had it now. He heard footsteps behind him, one set, fast, the sound of someone who knew buildings and had correctly read his direction. And he went faster through the dark corridor of the family wing, past closed doors and dust and the smell of a part of the house that time had stopped treating as inhabited, and hit the secondary staircase and went down. He came through the terrace door into the open air, 3 seconds of cold morning, and then into the ballroom through the north window. The same window he and Alara had used 2 nights ago. The sill at hip height, the old stone cold under his hands. He landed on the ballroom floor. The portrait was still on its makeshift easel, the woman with the half-recovered face. In the morning light, she looked less damaged than she had in the lamplight, or maybe Dante was reading her differently. Maybe what he was seeing was the restoration, the careful work that had been done by someone who believed that the truth underneath the damage was worth the effort of revealing. He went to the far wall. The ventilation panel was behind a section of wood paneling that looked identical to the sections on either side of it, but was, if you knew where to press, on a hinge. He pressed. It opened. Inside was the control panel his mother had shown him, a mechanical system, original to the building's construction, that operated the ballroom's ventilation and the fire doors on the estate's lower floors independently of the main building system, including the server room. He looked at the panel, found the correct lever, labeled in his mother's hand in pencil that had faded to near invisibility, but that he could read because he had looked at it once when he was 9 years old, and the brain retains what the body knows it might need. He pulled the lever that controlled the fire door on the service corridor. In the basement, the fire door between the server room corridor and the catering staging area would now be sealed. Alara was in the server room. She was now locked in with an air-gapped fire door between her and anyone trying to reach her. He had bought her time. He had also, he was aware, locked her in a basement room with no exit while Rocco's people controlled the building, which was either the most protective thing he had done for her or the most dangerous. And the difference between those 2 outcomes was entirely dependent on whether she could finish what she was doing before Rocco found another way through. The ballroom door opened. The man who came in was one of the 2 from the east staircase. He had been fast, and he had correctly read Dante's destination, and he came through the door with the confidence of someone who has found what they were looking for. He was large. He had the specific build of someone whose professional life involved physical confrontation. He looked at Dante. Dante looked at him. "Rocco wants you in the dining room," the man said. "I know what Rocco wants," Dante said. The man came at him without further conversation, which Dante had expected, and the next 45 seconds were ugly and physical and without any elegance whatsoever. It was two men in a ballroom with a 200-year-old painting on an easel trying not to damage anything they couldn't replace, which was a strange set of constraints for a fight. But the constraints were what they were. Dante took a hit across the jaw that sent white light across his vision and tasted blood on the inside of his cheek, and used the momentum of the impact to turn himself into a smaller target, and drove his elbow up into the man's chin with the kind of ugly, graceless precision that you develop not through training, but through having been in enough situations where elegance is a luxury you can't afford. The man went down, not out. Down on one knee, shaking his head. Dante stepped back, breathing hard. The copper taste of blood thick in his mouth. His jaw was already swelling. He looked at the man on the floor and felt no satisfaction. Just the physical reality of it. The cost extracted, the time bought, the morning still outside the arched windows, and 11 hours still remaining, and Alara still in the basement, and Rocco still in the building, and the microphone still waiting on the stage. He went to the door and locked it, and put his back against it and got his breathing under control. His phone showed a single text from a number he recognized as Alara's. Timestamp 4 minutes ago, 20 minutes. Don't move the fire door lever back. He typed back, "I know. How long?" Her response came in under a minute. Done. Sending now. 30 recipients. Direct. He read it twice. Then he closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds and opened them and looked at the portrait on its makeshift easel. The woman looking back at him from the canvas with her half-recovered face, her newly visible eyes, the damage that was still there and always would be, and had been made honest by someone who understood that honest was the only thing worth being. His phone showed the time, 8:41 in the evening. 34 minutes until he needed to be at the microphone. The door behind him shuddered, someone hitting it from the other side, testing it, not yet committed to breaking it. He heard voices in the corridor, muffled, and then Rocco's voice underneath them, quiet and cold. "Take the door." Dante looked around the ballroom. He looked at the north window, the one he had come in through, then at the ventilation panel, still open on its hinge, then at the portrait, then at the door, which was shaking harder now. He made his choice. He went to the window and opened it and looked down at the terrace, which was a 4-foot drop to stone, and then he looked back at the room, at the painting, at the careful restoration work, at the woman whose face Alara had spent days returning to the truth, and he reached over and turned the makeshift easel so that the portrait faced the wall. Not to hide it, to protect it. Then he went through the window, hit the terrace stone with both feet, and the impact jarred up through his knees, and he kept moving, around the north face of the building, back toward the main entrance, back toward the lights and the noise of the final preparation for the gala that was 45 minutes from beginning, and back toward the moment when Dante Viscari was going to walk to a microphone in front of 230 people, and he came through the main entrance at 8:53 with blood on his collar and his jaw swelling on the left side, and the specific look of a man who has made a decision that has cost him something already and is prepared to pay the rest. The gala was in full motion. 230 guests moved through the estate's main hall and reception rooms in the particular choreography of Rome's establishment at formal play. Senators talking to financiers, talking to judges, talking to museum directors, all of them performing the specific theater of people who understand that being seen in certain company is itself a form of currency. The chandeliers were lit. The white flowers were everywhere. The string quartet in the corner of the East reception room was playing something that nobody was listening to because nobody at these events ever listened to the music. The music was just proof that money had been spent correctly. Dante moved through the edge of it with his head up and his pace controlled. And two things happened in quick succession. He saw Benedetto near the coat room, who gave him a look that communicated, "I see you and I'm here," without any other signal. And he saw Rocco, across the main hall, standing near the entrance to the formal dining room with two men positioned at angles that were not casual. Rocco saw him at the same moment. The distance between them was 30 feet of marble floor and 230 people, and the entire architecture of a life that Dante was about to finish dismantling. Rocco's expression didn't change. He was too controlled for that, too practiced in the performance of equanimity at public events. But his right hand moved slightly, a small motion toward the nearest of his two men, and Dante understood that the calculation was happening in real time. Whether to move on Dante now, in this room, in front of these witnesses, or whether the witnesses were themselves the problem. Rocco chose correctly. He didn't move. Dante kept walking. He found a bathroom off the east corridor and went in and locked the door and looked at himself in the mirror. The jaw was worse than he'd estimated. A deep bruise already surfacing along the left side, the inside of his cheek still bleeding slightly when he pressed his tongue against it. His collar had blood on it from where he'd touched his mouth without thinking. The white catering shirt was gone. He'd shed it in the corridor and was in the dark shirt he'd worn underneath, which was wrinkled and slightly damp with the effort of the last 2 hours, but was at least what a host of a formal event might conceivably wear if the host had had a difficult day. He ran cold water over his hands, held them under until the temperature registered. His phone showed a text from Alara, timestamp 11 minutes ago. Out of server room, basement staging area. 30 recipients confirmed delivery. Rule responded, she had the document. Her upload portal was replaced, but her direct email was not. She has everything. He read it twice. Then, where are you now? Her response took 4 minutes, during which Dante stood in the bathroom and breathed and looked at himself in the mirror and did the thing his father had taught him to do before anything important. He found the still point. The place underneath the adrenaline and the pain and the anger and the thing that was not quite fear but occupied the same space. He found it, and he stood in it, and he let everything else move around it. Her text arrived. North corridor, first floor. Benedito found me. We're near the kitchen entrance. Are you hurt? He typed. Functional. Stay with Benedito. Don't come into the main hall until 9:15. A pause. Then, Dante. Rule is publishing at 9. She's running it as breaking news. We have 20 minutes before every phone in that room starts lighting up. 20 minutes. Which was both more than enough and almost nothing. He put the phone in his pocket, straightened his collar as much as it would straighten, and unlocked the bathroom door and went back out into the gala. He found the event coordinator, a small, efficient woman named Lucia who had organized Vescary events for 8 years, and who looked at his bruised jaw and his wrinkled shirt with the professional neutrality of someone who has learned that wealthy clients exist in a category beyond judgment, and told her he needed to move his remarks from 9:15 to 9 o'clock. Lucia looked at her tablet. The deputy minister is still speaking at 8:55. I'll follow him directly, Dante said. 2 minutes between. You can manage that. She looked at him for one more second, catalogued the jaw and the shirt and the absolute absence of any flexibility in his voice, and said, I'll adjust the program. At 8:58, Dante positioned himself near the stage entrance in the estate's main reception room, where the podium had been set up before a seated audience of approximately 160 guests, the remainder standing at the room's perimeter. The deputy minister, a heavy-set man with the practiced delivery of someone who has been giving speeches at events like this for 20 years, was wrapping up remarks about cultural philanthropy that nobody would remember by morning. Dante scanned the room. Rocco was at the back, standing, with his two men. He had seen the program adjustment. His face was doing something that had moved past controlled into rigid, which was the closest Rocco came to showing alarm. There were 4 other men positioned around the room that Dante identified as Rocco's, 3 by the exits, 1 near the stage. Benedetto was near the east door. Dante caught Benedetto's eye and tilted his head 1 degree toward the man near the stage. Benedetto's response was equally minimal, a single, slow blink. The deputy minister finished speaking. Applause, genuine and moderate. Lucia's voice at the podium. And now a few words from our host this evening, Dante Vescari. Dante walked to the stage. The man near the stage moved, not toward the podium, toward the side of the stage, the angle of interception, the place where he could reach Dante before the microphone. Dante saw it and walked faster, and heard behind him a brief, controlled commotion that was Benedetto handling the situation. And then he was at the podium, and his hands were on either side of it, and the room was in front of him. 160 seated faces and 40 standing, and the chandeliers overhead, and the flowers, and the quartet silent now in the corner, and Rocco at the back of the room with a face that had become something Dante had never seen on it before. Not rage. Fear. Dante looked at the room for exactly 3 seconds without speaking, long enough for the applause to fade, long enough for the quality of his silence to register as something other than preparation. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something that most of you will find difficult to believe, and some of you already know, and one person in this room will spend the rest of the evening wishing I hadn't." The room's ambient noise, the small sounds of 200 people in a shared space, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of feet, dropped away completely. 8 weeks ago, Dante said, a 40 million euro fraud was constructed using the financial infrastructure of the Viscari organization as its target and the Bellori Gallery as its instrument. My brother Marco was framed as the originating party. He has been in detention for 18 days, most recently transferred to a high-security facility under reclassified charges that were filed at the direction of Magistrate Aurelio Conti, who is a financial partner in the scheme that put him there. Somewhere in the room, someone's phone buzzed. Then 2 more. Then the sound became generalized, a wave of notification tones moving through the audience as Ginevra Rule's story hit the wire at 9 o'clock exactly, as she had promised. Nobody looked at their phone. Nobody in the room could look away from the podium. "I destroyed an innocent woman," Dante said. "Her name is Elara Bellori. She is 26 years old. She had no knowledge of or participation in the fraud scheme constructed through her gallery. I knew uncertainty existed. I had evidence in front of me that indicated her innocence, and I chose to suppress that uncertainty because I needed an outlet for my anger, and she was available. And her name was on the documents, and in my world that has always been sufficient." He paused. "I seized her assets. I froze her accounts. I confined her in this building. I manufactured a media narrative that destroyed her professional reputation and her standing in this community. I removed her mother's memorial from the Serbini Museum's scholarship program through pressure on the museum's board." He looked at the room. "I did those things. Not my organization, not my advisors. Me." The room was so quiet that the candles on the nearest table were audible. "The man who designed the original scheme," Dante said, "and who has spent the last 18 days managing my response to it in order to protect himself, is Rocco Salvi. He has been a senior advisor to this family for 30 years. He is in this room." The documentation supporting everything I have just said was transmitted 90 minutes ago to 30 journalists and prosecutors in 5 jurisdictions, and is currently being published by Ginevra Rule of the Rule Independent Bureau, which is why your phones are making noise. He stepped back from the podium. At the back of the room, Rocco moved. He moved toward the exit, the controlled, deliberate motion of a man who has calculated that the room is lost and is shifting to the next position. His 2 men moved with him. The guests nearest the exit moved instinctively aside, the crowd parting not in panic, but in the specific way of people who understand that something is happening that they should not be between. Gio was at the exit. He was not alone. He had 3 men with him, not Viscari organization men, but men wearing the identification of the Guardia di Finanza, Italy's financial police, who had been contacted by the Milan prosecutor Caruso at 8:45 that evening after Caruso's phone had mysteriously come back online, and he had reviewed the material Elara had sent and made 3 calls in rapid succession. Rocco stopped. He looked at the men at the exit. He looked at Gio. He looked back at the podium, at Dante, across the room full of Rome's establishment with their phones now out, recording, the story already moving through every network simultaneously, and he did the calculation. The last one. The one that told him that 30 years of management had run into the one variable he hadn't controlled, which was a 26-year-old art curator who had spent 9 days in a beautiful prison doing the thing she did best, which was looking at damage and finding the truth underneath it. Rocco put his hands up, not in surrender exactly, in the gesture of a man who understands that the room has changed and that the next move is no longer his to make. The Guardia di Finanza moved toward him. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not dramatic in the way that movies require drama. There were no shots fired. There was no chase through the estate's corridors. Rocco Salvi was taken into custody in the main reception room of the Vescari estate in front of 160 witnesses while the candles burned and the white flowers stood in their arrangements, and the string quartet in the corner did not play. His 2 men were taken separately. They offered no resistance. Dante stood at the edge of the stage and watched it happen and felt nothing that he could name cleanly. There was something in the range of relief, but it was not relief exactly. It was the absence of a weight that had been so constant he had stopped registering it as weight and had started registering it as structure, and now it was gone, and the structure was gone with it, and what remained was just himself, standing in a room full of people, with blood on his collar and a bruised jaw, and nothing behind him worth the name Empire. He was aware of movement to his left and turned. Alara came through the east door. She had found a jacket somewhere, set dark, too large for her, probably Benedetto's, and she was wearing it over the white catering shirt and her dark trousers, and her hair had come down from where she'd pinned it and was loose around her face, and she had the look of someone who has been in a basement for 2 hours doing something that required everything she had and has now come up into the air and is still slightly stunned by the fact of having air. She stopped at the edge of the room and looked at Rocco being walked toward the exit. She looked at the guests, many of them still recording, some of them talking rapidly into their phones. She looked at the podium where Dante had just said everything that needed to be said, in front of every witness that needed to hear it. Then she looked at Dante. He walked to her. He stopped 2 feet away, which was closer than he had stood to her in 9 days of living in the same building, and he looked at her face in the chandelier light. The exhaustion and the relief and the thing underneath both of those, the thing that was neither victory nor vindication, but was simply the complicated state of a person who has survived something that should not have had to be survived. "It's done," he said. "The evidence is out," she said. "That part is done." She paused. "You're not done." He knew what she meant. "No," he said. "I'm not." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the room. At Rome's establishment moving through its recalibration in real time, the conversations already shifting, the alliances already being mentally adjusted, the world of influence and connection doing what it always did when a power structure collapsed, which was to begin immediately calculating what would replace it. "I need to go outside," she said. He walked with her. Okay. The terrace on the north face of the estate was empty. The night was cold and clear, the rain from 10 days ago a distant memory, the sky above Rome showing a handful of stars through the light pollution. They stood at the stone balustrade and looked at the city spread below and said nothing for almost 3 minutes, which was a long time and also not enough. Then Alara said, "My mother's name." Dante said, "I'll restore the scholarship, the full amount, under whatever conditions the museum's board requires." "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "That's not what I was going to say. I was going to say that her name was the thing that mattered most to me of everything you took. Not the gallery, not the money. Her name." She paused. "I want you to understand that, not so that you'll fix it, because you can't fix it. You can restore it, but the weeks it was gone, the weeks it wasn't there, those exist. They don't unexist." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" He turned and looked at her. His jaw ached. His hands, resting on the balustrade beside hers, were bruised across the knuckles from the fight in the ballroom, and the cold stone was uncomfortable against them. And he registered all of this without adjusting his position because the discomfort was simply true, and true things deserve to be felt. "I understand that I took things that cannot be returned," he said. "I understand that what I can give back is not the same as what I took, and that the difference between them is mine to carry." He paused. "I'm not asking you to minimize that difference." Alara looked at him. Her expression was the one she wore when she was doing inventory, taking accurate measure, not looking for what she wanted to see, but for what was actually there. "No," she said finally. "You're not." She looked back at the city. "That's new." The word landed between them and settled. Below, through the estate's main entrance, they could hear the controlled movement of official vehicles, the Guardia di Finanza consolidating, the first wave of press arriving at the perimeter, the sounds of a formal structure being dismantled with the specific bureaucratic noise that dismantling makes. By morning, the full apparatus would be in motion. Prosecutors, asset freezes, the careful unwinding of 30 years of infrastructure that had been built precisely to resist exactly this kind of pressure. It would take time. Years, probably. Dante knew this. He had spent his life inside such a structure, and he understood its architecture, which meant he understood how long it took to deconstruct. He would cooperate. He had already decided this, somewhere in the farm building at 3 in the morning, and the decision had not changed and would not change because it was the only decision available to him that he could live with, and living with himself was something he was going to have to do for a long time. "Marco," he said. "Conti is being arrested tonight," Ilara said. "Caruso's office moved on him 40 minutes ago. Marco's reclassification will be vacated within 24 hours. She paused. "He should be out in a week." Dante exhaled. It wasn't dramatic, just a long, slow release of something that had been compressed in his chest for 18 days, and the release didn't feel like relief so much as it felt like the body's acknowledgement that it could finally stop holding. "He'll want to see you," Ilara said. "I know. And you'll have to explain what you did. All of it. Not just the political situation. What you did to me. I know that too." She looked at him. "Will you?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation, without the pause that used to precede difficult truths when he had still been managing his own image. "Yes. Everything." She nodded once. They stood in the cold for another minute. From inside the estate came a burst of voices, elevated, the particular pitch of people processing something large, and then it subsided back into the ambient noise of the evening. "The portrait," Ilara said. "It's in the ballroom. I turned it to face the wall before I went through the window, to protect it." Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, something more internal than that, something that recognized the gesture for what it was without needing it explained. "The restoration isn't finished," she said. "Another session, maybe 2. I'll have the materials kept as they are." "The estate may not be yours for much longer," she said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "Then I'll make arrangements before it isn't." He looked at her. "She deserves to be finished. Your words." Ilara looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "She does." Dante was arrested at 11:40 that night, in the estate's main entrance, by a prosecutor from Rome's white-collar crimes division who had arrived with the second wave of official vehicles. The arrest was not the result of the gala confession directly. The legal machinery moved on its own timeline, but the confession had, as Dante had known it would, made the prosecutor's position sufficiently clear that there was no discussion required about the nature of the proceedings. He was charged with unlawful detention, fraud facilitation, asset seizure without legal basis, and media manipulation. 4 counts, all documented, all supported by evidence that had been in 30 inboxes for 2 hours by the time the cuffs went on. He didn't resist. He didn't call his lawyer first, though his lawyer arrived within 20 minutes in a state of controlled professional fury. He stood in the entrance of his family's estate with his hands behind his back and looked, for just a moment, back at the room. The flowers, the chandeliers, the guests, the specific beautiful wreckage of an evening that had been designed for one purpose and had become something else entirely. Ilara was standing near the east corridor. She watched him being walked out. Her expression was not satisfaction and was not grief. It was the expression of someone witnessing the completion of something that needed completing, with full understanding of what it had cost and what it would continue to cost. He looked at her. She held his gaze. He nodded once. She nodded back. And then he went out through the doors of the Viscari estate for what would be, for a very long time, the last time. The weeks that followed were not clean. They were not the clean narrative that the press made of them. The crime boss who confessed, the innocent woman vindicated, the corrupt magistrate arrested, the 30-year conspiracy exposed. That narrative was true in its facts and false in its texture. the way newspaper stories are always true and false simultaneously, reducing the actual granular difficulty of human events into sequences that fit the shape of a story people can hold. The actual texture was different. Marco Vescari was released on the 12th day after the gala. He walked out of the high-security facility outside Rome on a Tuesday morning in November, thinner than he had been by 11 pounds, with the specific disorientation of someone who has spent 19 days in a controlled environment and is now required to re-navigate a world that has fundamentally changed shape while they were inside. His brother's lawyer met him at the facility entrance. Dante was not there, could not be there legally, but there was a letter. Marco read it in the car, cover to cover, twice, and then folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in his jacket pocket and looked out the window at the highway and said nothing for 40 minutes, and when the lawyer cautiously asked if he was all right, Marco said, "I need to buy flowers," and that was all. He visited Dante during the second week of Dante's pre-trial detention. The meeting was in a supervised room with a table bolted to the floor and institutional lighting that made everyone look ill. They sat across from each other and Marco looked at his brother's face, the jaw still faintly discolored, the overall reduction of a man who has been in institutional custody, and said, "You told me everything in the letter." "Yes," Dante said. "About the woman." "Yes." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Did she forgive you?" "No," Dante said. "I didn't ask her to." Marco looked at him for a long time with those eyes that had always been capable of seeing past what Dante showed to what Dante was. "That's different," Marco said finally. "That's actually different, Dante." "I know." Marco put his hand flat on the table between them, not reaching across it, just placing it there, an available presence. "I'm going to be all right," he said. "I want you to know that I am going to be all right, so that it's not in your head when you're sitting in here." Dante looked at his brother's hand on the table and felt something that he hadn't felt in a very long time, possibly since childhood, the specific warmth of being known by someone without performing anything, without managing the impression, without the buffer of power or control between the feeling and the person feeling it. "Thank you," he said. It was not enough. It was also exactly what it was. The Bellori Gallery reopened on a Thursday in late January, 4 months after the gala. The reopening was quiet by design. No press event, no announcement. A simple notice posted on the gallery's restored website and shared through the small network of artists and collectors who had maintained their connection to Alara during the months when maintaining it had required a certain amount of social courage. The first exhibition was called The Cost of Silence. It ran for 6 weeks and was reviewed by 8 publications, 3 of them in significant terms, and was attended by people who came back twice, which is the real measurement of an exhibition's effect on anyone. On the opening night, Alara received a small package by messenger. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue, was the restored portrait from the Vescari estate ballroom. The woman with the recovered face, the damage visible in the texture of the in-painting if you knew what to look for, which Alara did, but which read from any normal viewing distance as simply a beautiful painting of a woman who had survived the centuries with her dignity intact. On the back, in handwriting she recognized from 11 fraudulent invoices and 1 note left on an easel in a cold ballroom. "You taught me that restoration does not erase the damage. It reveals the truth and gives what remains a chance to become something honest." She turned the painting over and looked at the woman's face for a long time. Then she carried the portrait to the back of the gallery, where the light from the north-facing skylights fell clean and steady, and she hung it on the wall. She visited Dante twice during his sentence. The first visit was 6 months in, at a minimum security facility outside Rome, where he had been transferred following his full cooperation with the dismantling of the organization's remaining criminal infrastructure. The visiting room was not the institutional bleakness of Marco's detention facility. It had windows, at least, and light, and tables that were not bolted to the floor. He stood when she came in, which was the kind of detail that registers not because it's significant, but because it's true. She sat. He sat. "You look better than I expected," she said. "You expected badly." "I expected someone who had lost everything they understood about themselves," she said. "That tends to look a specific way." He held her gaze. And? You look tired, she said. Not destroyed. There's a difference. He thought about that. I've been working with the legal team on the asset recovery program for the fraud victims. There are 11 families who lost money in the scheme. Getting their assets back through the official process is, he paused, looking for the accurate word, bureaucratically medieval. But you're doing it. I'm doing it. She looked at him for a moment. The scholarship at the Serbini Museum is back, she said. I saw it last week. Her name, in the original typography. My lawyers handled the restoration in September, he said. I would have told you sooner, but I didn't know if you wanted. I know, she said. I saw it. That's what I said. He was quiet. I'm not here to tell you it's enough, she said. It's not enough. It's just true. And true things matter, and I wanted you to know I saw it. She looked at her hands on the table. The gallery is doing well. The foundation application is moving through approval. There are 3 young artists in the first cohort who are. She paused, and something in her voice shifted slightly, the controlled professional tone admitting something more personal. They're extraordinary. One of them works in restoration. She's 22. She has a way of seeing damage that is. She stopped. Anyway. Tell me, Dante said. She looked up at him. Tell me about her, he said. The 22-year-old. Tell me what she does. So Alara told him. She talked for 20 minutes about the young artist and the technique she had developed and the painting she was working on, a damaged 18th century landscape that everyone else had written off as beyond recovery. And Dante listened in the way that Marco had always listened, without the buffer of the next thing he was going to say, just actually present with what was being said. And it was the most ordinary conversation he'd had in 2 years, and it was the one he needed most. When the visit ended and she stood to leave, she stopped at the door and turned back. You don't get to decide whether you're forgiven, she said. I want to be clear about that. That belongs to me. And it moves on my timeline, and some of it may never arrive, and that's mine to determine and not yours to resolve. Yes, he said. But you're not the same man who walked into that study and decided my name was sufficient cause for destruction. She held his gaze steadily. I see that. I'm not saying it so that you'll feel better. I'm saying it because it's accurate and ideal in accuracy. She left. Dante sat in the visiting room after she was gone and let the weight of what had just happened settle into him without trying to manage it, or name it, or turn it into something easier to carry. He sat with it the way you sit with a restored painting, when you understand both what it was and what it cost to become what it now is. The woman in the portrait recovered from damage, honest in her survival. He sat with that for a long time. Tratek. Years later, 4 of them, with everything that 4 years contain, there was an exhibition in Rome called Rebuilding, Art and Identity After Loss. It was held at a venue that was not the Viscari estate, which had long since been transferred to a legal trust as part of the criminal asset resolution, and which had been converted into a cultural center whose board of trustees included, in a detail that no press release thought to mention, a young restoration artist who had completed her training under Ilara Bellori's foundation program. The exhibition honored people who had rebuilt their professional and personal lives following institutional betrayal: artists, curators, scholars, journalists whose work had been stolen or suppressed by people with more power than conscience. Ilara was one of the honorees. She arrived alone, in a dark dress that was not the charcoal coat of 4 years ago, but occupied the same register. Elegant without performance, chosen for the person wearing it rather than for the room. She moved through the opening hour with the ease of someone who had rebuilt herself into someone she actually recognized, which is a different thing from who she had been before, and not a lesser thing, just different, shaped by what had happened without being defined by it. At 8 in the evening, she turned from a conversation with a journalist and found herself looking across the room at Dante Viscari. He was not dramatically changed. He was older, which 4 years is. He was wearing a dark jacket and no tie and looked like a man who had spent a significant portion of the intervening years doing unglamorous work in rooms that didn't care how he was dressed. He was standing near the far wall, close to a painting she recognized, not the family portrait which lived at the gallery now, but a smaller piece by the same hand, a study of hands and light that she had not seen before. He had not seen her yet. She looked at him for a moment, at the person he was now, which she had been watching become itself across 2 supervised visits and 1 written correspondence, and the reliable testimony of people who worked with the victim recovery program where he had been volunteering since his release. She looked at the tiredness that had not left his face but had changed in character, become the tiredness of sustained effort rather than the tiredness of sustained performance. She looked at the way he was looking at the painting, genuinely, without posturing, the way people look at things when they're not aware of being observed. She walked across the room. He heard her footsteps and turned, and for a moment his expression did the thing that faces do when the person they're looking at is the one person in the world they did not expect and most needed to see, and it was unguarded in a way that 4 years ago his face had not been capable of. They stood in front of the painting together. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "I'm being honored," she said. "You?" "The foundation board invited me. I almost didn't come." He paused. "I almost came anyway, and then almost didn't again several times." "Why did you come?" He looked at the painting. "Because avoiding things I'm afraid of has historically not served me well." She looked at the painting too. It showed 2 hands, one older, one younger, positioned close to each other without touching, in the specific arrangement of someone teaching something to someone who is learning it. The light fell across them in a way that made the space between the hands feel significant rather than empty. "The restoration program has its first graduating cohort this spring," she said. 6 artists. The 22-year-old I told you about. She's presenting her recovered landscape at an exhibition in Milan in March. "I saw," he said. "I've been following the foundation's announcements." A pause. "I hope that's not—" "It's fine," she said. They were quiet for a moment. Around them, the exhibition moved through its evening. Conversations, the sound of careful attention being paid to art and to the stories it held. The specific atmosphere of a room full of people who have been through something and have not been destroyed by it. "I owe you an apology that I haven't given you properly," Dante said. Not suddenly, carefully, as if he had been deciding when to say it and had decided now. Not the one at the estate, and not the one in the visiting room. Those were both real, but they were also— He stopped. "I was still managing something in both of those, still trying to present myself at the right angle." Alara looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the invoices and the press and the accounts and the gallery and your mother's name, and every morning you woke up in that building and knew you were a prisoner." He said it plainly, without the architecture of justification around it. "I had doubt, and I chose not to honor it because honoring it would have required me to be uncertain, and I had built my entire life on the idea that uncertainty was weakness. That was a lie I told myself, and you paid for it." The room continued around them. Neither of them moved. "I know," she said. "I know you know." He looked at her directly. "I needed to say it in a way that wasn't also a request for something." She held his gaze, reading him the way she read things, accurately, without preference for a particular outcome. "All right," she said. Then she extended her hand. He looked at it. She held it there, open, between them. Not a concession, not an invitation to anything beyond itself, just a hand extended by a free woman who had decided, in this moment, to offer a specific acknowledgement to a specific person for a specific reason that was hers alone. He took her hand. His grip was careful, not tentative, careful, the particular care of someone who has learned the difference between holding something and possessing it, and has chosen, after everything, to hold. They stood like that in front of the painting for a moment, the 2 hands in the canvas close but not touching. The 2 hands in the room touching, the light falling across all of it without making any judgment about what it illuminated. Then Alara released his hand and he released hers, and they stood for another moment in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have been through the worst of each other and have arrived, separately and by different roads, at something that was not forgiveness yet, and was not love yet, and was not anything with a clean name, but was real, and was honest, and was theirs to carry forward into whatever came next. Outside, Rome moved through its evening, indifferent and magnificent, as it always had and always would, holding in its streets and stones an ancient light the evidence of every empire that had risen and broken and given way to whatever survived the breaking. Some things can't be restored to what they were. They can only become what they are now. And sometimes, if the work has been done honestly and the damage has been looked at without flinching, what remains is enough.